Welcome back to my new video. This video, we are going to talk about resource quotas in Kubernetes. So when several users or teams share a cluster with a fixed number of nodes, there is a concern that one team could use more than its fair share of the resources. So resource quotas are just tools for administrators to address this concern. A resource quota defined by the resource quota object in Kubernetes provides that constraints that limit aggregate resource consumption per namespace. It can limit the quantity of objects that can be created in the namespace by type, as well as the total amount of compute resources that may be consumed by resources in that namespace. So setting quotas for the total amount of memory and CPU that can be used by all ports that are running in the namespace. The administrator then creates one resource quota for each namespace. So you could have many namespaces, but the administrator would assign different resource quotas to those names based on the need of the team members. So users create objects like ports, services, replica sets, deployments, and all that in the namespace. And then the quota system would then track the usage to ensure that it does not exceed hard resource limits defined in the resource quota object. If creating or updating a resource violates a quota constraint, then the request will fail with an HTTP status code of 403, which is forbidden, with a message explaining the constraint that would have been violated. Okay, so if you look at the middle of the YAML file, you see that we have a meta name, or okay, let's put it this way: a kind to be what? Resource quota, and then the name is what? Ports high, and then there's under the specification you have hard, CPU, and then the memory. Okay, if you look at the other one, is ports medium, and then you have the CPU, the memory, and then the last one is ports low. Okay, the hard limit is CPU 5 and memory 10 gig. Okay, so this is how you define resource quotas in your different namespaces based on the need of team members. Okay, so let's jump to our YAML file definition, and I'll explain to you. So I'm in my terminal. So let's check my Kubernetes clusters. So I'm saying kubectl get nodes. So I have two Kubernetes nodes running. And then I'm in the folder with 3 files. One is quota memory CPU. The second one is quota memory CPU port 1 and then port 2. Okay, so if we cut quota mem CPU, you see, we have the kind to be what? Resource quota. The name is what? Mem CPU demo. And then under the spec, we have hard limit. And then the request for CPU is what? One core. And then the request for memory is 1 gig. Okay, take note, we are requesting for memory size of 1 gig. And then the limit for CPU is 2 cores. And then the limit for memory is 2 gig. Okay, so now let's create this resource quota. So we're going to say kubectl apply -f. Okay, so before we start, let's create a namespace for this. So I'm going to delete this because we need to set a quota in a namespace. So I'm going to say kubectl create namespace YouTube. And then we're going to make use of the YouTube namespace. So I'm going to say config set namespace to be YouTube. So we're going to say apply quota mem cpu.yaml. So if we say kubectl get resource quota. So as you can see, this is the name of the resource quota. And then we are requesting for 1 core and then a memory of 1 gig. So now we have 0 out of 1 gig. And then we have 0 out of 1. And then the limit we set is what? 2 CPU, 0 out of 2. Memory limit is 0 out of 2. Okay. So now let's create our port, the port 1. Okay. So we're going to look at port 1. So as you can see, this is the kind is what is a port, and then the name, the meta name is quota memory CPU demo. And then the image is Nginx. And then the resource limit. Okay, the limit is what? 800 megabytes. And then the CPU is 800 megabytes or 0.8 bytes. And then we are requesting for 600 megabytes of memory. And then we are requesting for 400 megabytes or milli CPU or 400, okay? Or the same time 0.4 bytes. That is what we are requesting for this port. So this port, when created, it's going to request for memory 600 megabytes and then 400 milli CPU or milli cores. You can call it milli cores, 400 milli cores or 400 milli CPU or 400 milli CPU. Yeah, that should be it. That should be the right word or the right unit. Okay, so let's create this port. So we're going to say kubectl apply -f. So it's been created, so we can check the port. So we're going to say kubectl get ports. So now we have container creating, so we can check it one more time. So now as you can see, it's running. This port is running with no issues because the limit is within the range. Okay, so if we describe this port, let's describe it. kubectl describe port, and then we want to output it as what? As a YAML. As a YAML. Okay, let's just describe it. Okay, so as you can see, the limit is being set to 800 for CPU and 800 for memory. And then we are requesting for 400 milli cores for CPU and then 600 for memory. Okay, so that is what we have set for this port. So what this thing means is that the resource quota places this requirement on the YouTube namespace, okay? And let's say Okay, let me cut the coda.yaml. Okay, so what this information means is that for every pod in the YouTube namespace, each container must have a memory request and then a memory limit, CPU request, as well as CPU limit. And then the memory request total for all ports in that YouTube namespace must not exceed 1 gig. And then the memory limit total for all ports in the YouTube namespace must also not exceed 2 gig. Okay. And then the CPU request total for all ports in the YouTube namespace must also not exceed 1 CPU. The CPU limit total for all ports in that YouTube namespace must also not exceed 2 CPU. So that is what it means, must not exceed 2 CPU. The memory limit also must not exceed 2 gig. Okay. That is the best explanation I can give so far. So now let's check let's get resource coda. Okay, I'm going to say kubectl get resource coda, and then the resource coda is mem cpu -demo, and then we want to output it as what? As a YAML. Okay, so as you can see under the spec, all the specifications are being set. And then these are the hard limits. Okay, so the status right now is under the status. You see that these are the hard limits, same as the top here. And then the one that has been used by the pod so far is what? 800. That is what we requested for. So this is the request. Okay, 400 millicores as well as 600 megabytes. Okay, so this is what we are requested for, and that is what we have used so far. Okay, so we have used this out of this. Okay, so that is what we have used so far. So if we go beyond this limit, we want to create a pod that will go beyond this limit. That means it's going to violate the limit or the resource coda that this namespace can handle. Okay, so let me do kubectl get resource codes. Okay, so as you see, I requested for 400 out of the one, and then for the memory I requested for 600 megabyte out of 1 gig. Okay, so the limit that I set was 800 for CPU and then 800 for memory. Okay, so now let's go and create a new pod. Okay, kubectl get kubectl apply -f pod number 2. Okay, and then we run this. Okay, so let's see what is in pod number 2. Okay, so as you can see, we are requesting for 700 megabytes and then 400 megabyte or millicores, okay, or milli CPU, 400 milli CPU. Okay, and then the limit is what? 1 gig, and then the CPU is 800. Okay, that is the limit we are requesting for this second pod. Okay, so as we try creating that pod, you see there's a forbidden message that says what? Exceeded quota, requested for 700, and then we used 600 megabytes, and then the limit is being limited by what? 1 gig. Okay, so we are unable to create this port because if we create, so if we add 600 plus 700, okay, so let me cut one. So you see, the memory request was 600, and then now we want to add 700. So if you add it, we're going to get 1003, okay? So you see that it's going to go beyond the 1 gig limit threshold, okay? So because of that, you see the limit threshold was 1 gig, as you can see, limited to this. So if you add 700 to 600, it will go beyond 1 gig, okay? So Kubernetes will not allow you, because you've restricted or you've constrained all the ports that will be created in this namespace to 1 gig. Okay, we are requesting of maximum 1 gig. So any port that you create, you must make sure that it's still within that 1 gig. Okay, so that is how you set constraints for your memory and CPU inside your namespace for all team members. Okay, so if you think you create a namespace and team members will need more resources in that namespace, you create a resource quota, and then, or you increase it so that one particular team member wouldn't monopolize all the resources in that namespace. So this is just a check and balance against people who wants to monopolize all the resources on your Kubernetes clusters. Yeah, so I think that is all for this video. If you have any questions, suggestions, please, also you can leave them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like the video, share it, and then subscribe. Please, I need your subscription. It's going to help the channel grow bigger and better. Okay, so I'll see you in the next one.